global south plus China are refusing to put up with this anymore. Absolutely refusing, point blank. We've seen enough of this nonsense. We're not putting up with it anymore. What we're going to do is we're going to organize ourselves against this rubbish. And that's what really scares them, I think. And that's why we're seeing, I think, a rather confused response in many ways from the US.
Welcome to our first episode of the No Cold War Britain podcast. I'm Ileana Chan, and my co-host is Fiona Edwards. We are really excited to be bringing you more in-depth discussions every month on the key issue of our time, stopping the US new Cold War offensive and Britain's role in this major threat to world peace and prosperity. We will be bringing you voices from Britain and internationally to delve deeper into why this new Cold War is happening, what the dangers it presents, and how we can build a movement to stop it. For our first episode today, we are joined by the fantastic Roger McKenzie. Roger is the international editor of the Morning Star, Britain's only daily socialist newspaper. As the international editor, Roger writes about world affairs every day. He is a former Assistant General Secretary of Unison, one of the biggest trade unions in Britain, and he has spent decades campaigning for social justice, against discrimination and oppression, and on many international campaigns. Roger, it is an honor to have you on the show, and I'm sorry that I emphasize decades as if you're incredibly old. And that's why
I was going to say something about that. You make me feel really old now.
I think it's just to speak to
My
your
little walking stick by the side of it.
Well,
no, thanks for having me on. It's a real honor. Thank you.
Welcome, Roger. So, since we are the No Cold War Britain pod, I think our first question needs to be how you see this new Cold War, which is developing. How do we define the new Cold War? And what does it mean for all of us? What does it mean for humanity?
I think, well, firstly, let me repeat, thank you so much for inviting me to be part of this podcast. I think this is going to be a really important podcast, actually. And I think the reach of the organization across the globe is really important as well, because this isn't something that's just about how we see things in the UK. I think one of the ways of viewing this actually comes from a perspective of the global south. And I think that's often left out of the kind of discourse, really. So as somebody whose heritage is from the global south, I kind of tend to look at things from that direction myself. So new Cold War, for me, not so new, really. I think it's been going on for quite some time. And I think you can go back some way, actually, to look at what are the origins of this Cold War. And I think you can actually go back before the last Cold War, if you like, the supposed one between the US, its allies, and the so-called communist bloc. I think it goes beyond that. I think it goes back to the Monroe Doctrine. I think it goes back to the I think it's called the full spectrum dominance that the US has. And for me, that's really a key part of this, because what it says is that this isn't just about a country like the US just being evil or something. This is about profit. And I think, we can sugarcoat it all we want. We can, wrap it up in pretty paper and smother it in perfume or whatever. But actually, it's about profit, and it's about the interest of the corporate elites in the US. And for me, I always look at it that way in terms of the full spectrum dominance bit, because when I first came across this, what it actually says is quite startling, that the United States will take every measure available to them, whether it's military, economic, even in space, right? They will take every opportunity to safeguard the interests of corporate USA. And that's what it really means. So if any country is going to threaten that dominance of the US, then they're going to take steps, literally any steps that they feel that they can get away with to be able to do that. Of late, what we're seeing, of course, is that they don't just do it themselves. They get other countries to do it on their behalf. And again, that's not also not particularly new. They've been doing that for a long time as well. But I think when you look back at kind of Vietnam and stuff, and reports of kind of films of body bags coming back, and even after, even with Iraq and stuff as well, and Afghanistan, they didn't want to kind of go down that road again of films on the evening news of body bags at airports and stuff. So they get other countries to do it for them, like they're doing with Ukraine right now. So I think it's not a new Cold War. I think it's a Cold War about the dominance of US capital. I think it's something, as I've said, that's gone on for some time. But what has really thrown the mix for the US really is that the global South plus China are refusing to put up with this anymore. Absolutely refusing, point blank. We've seen enough of this nonsense. We're not putting up with it anymore. What we're going to do is we're going to organize ourselves against this rubbish. And that's what really scares them, I think. And that's why we're seeing, I think, a rather confused response in many ways from the US. So at one level, they'll rush off to countries in the global South across Africa and say, well, we'll give you seats on the UN Security Council, and we'll do this, and we'll build a railroad for you because we know that China can build good railroads for you, and have promised to do this, that, and the other. So they're promising all of this sort of stuff. Yet at the same time, they've still got this big military stick that they try and throw at everybody. So I think it's a rather confused approach from the US, but I think it's because of the unity that's been developed across the global South with China, and I have to say with Russia as well, but also that feeling of anti-colonialism that is, I think, really strong now when you look across West and Central Africa as well, which is part of the whole mix, I think, about how this whole global kind of conflict, even in words, is going to be played out. And I think what happens there is that all of these countries just said, we're going to have friendships and trade and whatever with whoever we want. You're not going to dictate that to us, United States. We'll do what the hell we want to do. So it's a really defining moment, I think, at the moment. Long answer, I know, but I think it's a really, really kind of pivotal moment at the moment in world politics.
That's a really interesting way to start the podcast, Roger. I really appreciate all your insights on what's happening in the world. I mean, one of the things I was thinking when you said about the United States rolling out these promises is often they're very empty. They don't build the railways, they don't bring finance. Look at the commitments that have been made under the Paris Agreement for 100 billion to the global South a year. That's still not happening, which is a travesty, really. And
well, I think that's part of it, Fiona, because I think a lot of the global South have had these promises for forever, and the United States says, yeah, well, we'll do this, that, and the other for you, and it ends up costing the global South more than it did before, even whether in terms of debt or in terms of some of the other strings that the United States might place on these relationships. So if we do this, then you have to support us in, I don't know, this time condemning Russia for invading Ukraine or whatever. So I think people have seen through, I think so many countries have seen through this these empty promises from the US and have decided to take a different route. I think one of the really important things that happened this week was Gutierrez said this week, he said he recognized, and it's the first time I've heard him say it, he recognized that we are already in a multipolar world. And I thought, wow, for him to say that now, like literally a few days before the General Assembly, which starts on Monday, I thought that's really telling. And what he said on top of that, which I also thought was interesting, was he said a multipolar world could bring equilibrium to the world. So a recognition there is not equilibrium now, but a multipolar world could help to bring more equilibrium. So I just think we're in quite exciting times, and as ever, I think how the global South and those who've had enough of the dominance of the US behave at this moment is going to really be influential for what happens for the next 10, 15, 20, 25 years time.
Well, oh, sorry, Ileana, go ahead.
I figured, like, since we are no Cold War Britain, where do you think the UK, where do we fit into what you're talking about?
I think I saw a brilliant interview by, I think it was Andrew Ma with I remember the guy from China, but basically
Victor Gao.
Yeah, I thought that was superb. Yeah, I think you shared it on social media. It's superb because basically for me, the big thing out of that, to answer your question, was really saying, you know, the UK is really not as important as it thinks it is. It is a small country off the coast of Europe that really hasn't got that much economic power anymore, that is living, it seems to me, and I've gone on from where the person from China was talking about, but it seems to me the time of British dominance based on its massive empire, which the sun never set on, and all of that sort of nonsense, has long gone. It is not a major trading nation, which is also one of the reasons it's not able to do excuse me, it's not able to do trade deals with anybody at the moment. But it's also just not strong and politically and big enough, and it's got no muscle. So in terms of what it means, what a Cold War means for Britain, it's actually quite dangerous, actually, in many ways, because the British will try and say we are still important, and we can, number one, base nuclear weapons from the United States on our land, which is what they're doing, and we're getting more of that again now. But also they'll just back up, as they pretty well always do, whatever the United States wants to do. So the role of the British, it seems to me, and of course you can't minimize the fact that Britain also has nuclear weapons, and that's perhaps the most important thing that they bring to the whole scenario at the moment, is that you can't underestimate their role in as a supporting act for the US. And for me, that it seems to me that's their major thing at the minute. But there's far more important countries that China, which this is all aimed at, obviously, has to be concerned about. And not least of which, of course, is the United States and the way that they still control their kind of puppet regimes around the world. But I think Britain's role isn't as important as it used to be. But I think the fact that they have nuclear weapons still gives it an important, a role that you can't ignore fully. But in terms of trade and economics across the globe, nowhere near as important as it used to be.
Wondering if we could return back to this theme of the global South that you kind of introduced things on about. This is what, the Cold War, really key feature of the Cold War is the fact, and the world situation is the fact that so many countries in the global South are refusing to go along with the US's attacks on both Russia and China. And this was, I think, really clearly reflected in the recent BRICS summit at the end of August. And I wondered, what are your takeaways from that summit and how it fits into the overall picture?
I think BRICS was really, really important. I think the whole, I think wider than the summit itself, I think the whole kind of coalescing around BRICS, I think, is it's really pivotal, really, in the global politics of the time, of this moment, and for a number of reasons. One, and I should say, I think it's really easy to overblow how important it is, but I think it's also just worth spending a little bit of time just recognizing what we're seeing here. We're seeing, Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa already working closely together. These are 5 powerful countries in their own right. And it's important to recognize that these are countries that don't share the same politics. So there's other reasons why they're doing this. And that reason is predominantly economic and what they can bring to the table. Economic shouldn't rule out the fact that some of this changes as politics within some of those countries change and what happens then afterwards. But economically, it's massive, and it represents a large part of the global GDP and a large part of the global population. So you've also got, as part of that, of course, the 2 most populous nations on the planet, in India and China, as part of that, with opposing political views as well. But then you look at the countries that are being that will join from January. Now, these are important countries. The fact that you can get Saudi Arabia and Iran to join at the same time is huge. And you have to place a load of that credit for that to China, it seems to me, and the impact that that could have on the globe. But also, this could, and looks as though it very well may, stop the longest conflict on the planet so far, or active conflict. I mean, you've still got Korea's going on, but which is still never been stopped officially. But actually, Yemen, China brokered that deal that brought the Saudis and the Iranians together. They're now exchanging diplomatic personnel, opening embassies in each other's countries. This is major stuff. And then they come together in BRICS. And then Argentina can come together in BRICS. Really important for Brazil to have Argentina as part of that. So you've got the 2 biggest players in South America, then as part of BRICS. You've got South Africa as part of it. You've got Ethiopia, who will be part of it as well. So you're then bringing in Eastern Africa into all of this. It'd be interesting to see what happens with the kind of west of Africa in all of this. Eventually, I think there's some places missing. So you've got nothing from the Caribbean yet. And I think that's huge, actually. So I know Cuba is, kind of around and talking about possibilities, but no Caribbean nation is part of it yet. None. And for me, as somebody whose heritage is from there, then you have to examine why that might be, and maybe some of the role of Britain in kind of and their dominance of the so-called Commonwealth may be partly to do with all that. But I don't see that lasting. I see Caribbean nations coming in to some of that. I'm writing a piece coming up in the Morning Star about the Caribbean potential relationship to BRICS as well. I think one of the biggest things about BRICS, one of them's been overblown, which is the currency, the reserve currency thing. I'd love to see that. I still think it's not an impossibility. I know from our discussions that some people think that it's not going to happen. I wouldn't, take that off the table just yet. But I think for me, one of the really important things is the encouragement that BRICS is giving to nations to trade in their own currencies. I just think that's massive. So, lots of talk about de-dollarization, but removing the dollar as the main currency for the trade of oil is huge. Absolutely massive. And so you've got Saudi Arabia, all of the, all the countries within the orbit of Saudi Arabia coming together through BRICS. I think that's going to be massive. And we can't underestimate, I think, what that will mean for the US. It will be a massive psychological blow to them, as well as I think a big economic blow to them. I think countries trading in their own currencies as well really undermines the ability of the US to be able to impose sanctions on these countries, which is a big part of the way that the US, of course, is able to bully nations across the globe. And I think that's huge as well. So it removes the ability of the bully to be able to do their thing. And I think that is something that will be really hard for the US to take, but massive for the global South in the way that they're going to be able to relate to each other. I often go back to this kind of thought about how these relationships between any country really works. It's only able to work on the basis of respect. So if you have mutual respect between countries, then that is great. What you haven't got at the minute towards the US, they don't respect any other country on the planet, and nobody respects them really, because of the way that they behave. But you're in a different ball game now when you've got all of these countries, with the way that BRICS is being established, the whole mood music around BRICS, and the way that there just seems to me to be a whole lot of respect between people and between these countries. I think that makes a massive, massive difference. And that China has spelt this out in policy documents about the need for mutual respect and the way that is cornerstone of their foreign policy. I can't remember another country actually that has talked about that in the same sort of terms and actually written it down. Some of them have said it and not done it, but they've actually written about it and are following it through in the way that they respect other countries. And for me, that is the real potential for BRICS, is that it could lead to greater cooperation, but real mutual respect between nations. And I just think that's massive. So BRICS, I think, is huge and is going to get bigger. I think it's going to be interesting to see what the next phase is after January, and how the further expansion works, and how those economic relations between the different countries is carried out, hoping that it doesn't end up with a similar sort of thing to the European Union, where it turns into some monolith, kind of horrible bureaucratic kind of thing that nobody likes and trusts at all. I don't see that happening with BRICS. I think it's going to be an interesting period going forward.
Just picking up on what you said around China's foreign policy being about mutual respect, that's definitely not what you hear in the mainstream Western media. You hear a lot of negative stories about China. One of the key lines that they like to put forward in mainstream press is China is the new colonizing force in the world, and it's trying to take over Africa and Latin America. I can see from your expression you don't agree with that, but I just wanted to know what do you make of these claims that are made all the time about China?
Well, it's what the corporate media does, and again, this is just straight from the playbook of what they've always done. You It's not even what they just do to China. It's not just what they've done to the Soviet Union in the past. It's what they've always done to, yeah, you have to demonize the so-called enemy. Actually, it's what they did. It's a similar thing in a way, to what they did in terms of race. So you had to demonize people of African descent as a justification for the racism you were about to inflict on us. So you have to demonize China to be able to say, well, they're just kind of evil folk who are after doing us down, and you try and use that to generate what was it Chomsky said, manufacture the consent to be able to do whatever it is you want to do against these people, because after all, they're not really human, and anyway, they're evil and want to do things to us. So you create that kind of atmosphere. I think within all of this, of course, is the disgraceful role of corporate media in all of this, that is rarely called out. Even when they're caught out, it's just, so we can write about it in the Morning Star. Sadly, our readership levels aren't the same as these corporate newspapers. Our paper's owned by the readers of the paper. But even when somebody like the New York Times gets caught out for just being the mouthpiece of the State Department in the US in the run-up to the Iraq War, they haven't even apologized ever for it, and they got caught out. It's there in black and white that they just lied and just took, basically were just taking press releases from the State Department and just sending them out. They haven't never apologized for their role in what was an illegal war, and they'll continue to do that, and they continue to put this nonsense out about China, and they don't get picked up for it. And actually, this is why we need a wholesale revision of the way that the press is run and owned, not just in the UK, but globally as well. We need to see the encouragement of much more things like this, actually, where we hear straight from people about what is actually going on in their countries, because you can actually, some of these papers, the New York Times, the Washington Post, the Guardian, so-called left-wing newspaper in the UK, all of these newspapers, that they just print nonsense, and people just still think, even though most people say, well, you can't believe it because it was in the paper, actually they do when they look at it. And take it all in, and then go and say to their mates, yeah, but it's them lot over there, and all the stuff that was written about Corbyn over the years, and they just believe this nonsense without ever examining the true facts of it. And so we need a much more independent media that's rooted in the people, that's owned by the people, that actually as well is looking to, I also think on top of all of that, we need to develop much more of an independent socialist media, really, across the globe. Is something that I'm trying to work with a load of colleagues on across the globe, just to develop that kind of network of progressive journalists that is going to be able to, report independently. And of course, what these corporate media say to any of us who say that we're going to report, we're going to have independent reporting, is they say, yeah, but that means that you're all kind of Trotskyite kind of nutcases or whatever. And you're not independent at all. What you are is just the mouthpiece of, they usually say you're the mouthpiece of Russia, you're the mouthpiece of China, blah, 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 right? We'll ignore the fact that they're the mouthpiece of Washington, DC, Paris, London, whatever, right? So, but all we can ever do is just keep telling telling it as we see it on the ground, and talking about what people on the ground are actually saying about the material circumstances that they're finding themselves in. And those material circumstances are people can't afford to live. They can't afford to put bread on the table. They can barely afford to keep a roof over their heads. I've written a piece for tomorrow's paper that talks about, there was a report at the UN yesterday, talks about 700 million people don't know where they're going to get their next meal from, or if they're going to get a meal ever again, right? 700 million people, right? That will be hardly reported anywhere else, hardly reported, right? It'll be a piece in the Morning Star tomorrow, right? But this isn't new, right? Where all of this stuff is happening. So we need people to talk about what is happening and, of course, why it's happening, because part of why it's happening was also reported yesterday at the Security Council, was that aid has dried up, humanitarian aid has dried up across the globe. Why is it dried up? Because they're putting money into the military. That's why, to stoke their wars, the war in Ukraine and the 30-odd other wars that are taking place across the globe, right? And a result of that is people are dying because they can't eat. That doesn't get reported by anybody but the progressive media, right? And we have to just keep creating the space for that work to happen, for that reporting to get out there to people, because I think eventually when we're talking about those things, eventually we're able to get across to people that what is actually happening, because more and more what I see is people are identifying with this stuff and saying, you know what, we can't afford to eat in the UK either. We can't afford to eat. Massive levels of poverty in the US. And they look at it and say, yeah, but you've just Biden asked for 26 billion more dollars last week, I think it was, to go to Ukraine. And there's people having to live on the streets in just down the road from where he made that decision in Washington, D.C. It's dreadful.
Actually, that makes me think as well of how in the US, it's the same sort of like almost monolithic propaganda against China as they're escalating against China. But there also seems to be talk, rather from a slightly different perspective of, the business community that have interests in China. And so I was wondering if you had well, for one thing, I'm kind of interested in how that's going to play out, like narratively. And also, is the same sort of dynamic happening in the UK?
I think what's going to happen is that more and more big business will see the writing on the wall. Actually, I was coming back from Paris the other day on the train, and just overhearing some. And no, I wasn't in business class, but overhearing some business people sitting in front of me just chatting, and they were really clear about there's money to be made, and China was one of the places where they thought they could make some money, and I think there's all sorts of difficulties with that, but actually once business is starting to think that way, then given that they buy and sell politicians in both the US and the UK and France and all over, basically. I think there's the potential for some difference in approach from those countries. I'm not saying for a second that they're going to abandon Babylon Central, Washington, D.C. They're not going to do that, right? But there may well be a different approach. And maybe we start to see some of this with the far right in the US, who are starting to talk about a kind of different approach for some of the wrong reasons, but looking at a different approach to military spending. Not because they want to see less military spending necessarily, or the strength of the US diminished at all, but I think they're interested in making money. So I'm not sure that that it's sustainable for the US at the minute in terms of the way that they're going about their business. I'm just not sure that it's sustainable, because I think they're going to come under pressure from big business when somebody else is finding a new way of making profits. Because at the end of the day, capitalism only has kind of two objectives, really. Number one, survival. Number two, make profits. Actually, third, make more profits. That's about it. So if they're seeing somebody else achieving those things, I think they'll get a little bit worried about that, and look to maybe tack a little bit in terms of what it is they want to do. Of course, the other thing that they could do is an extension of what seems to be happening now, which is an undermining of progressive nations like China, and maybe they'll go for that. So maybe it's about, for them, they'll partly what they try to do with Russia, let's kind of weaken them militarily and go, and maybe there'll be regime change which will allow business into Russia. But we can't forget, of course, that there was loads of these Western businesses who were in Russia during even Putin's time, sort of, and have been there since the demise of the Soviet Union. So I just think this is a really changeable period. I think it's hard to predict, but I think the only thing you can ever predict is that capital wants to make money, and then they want to make more money. The only way that they can really make money and more money is by exploiting people, because that's the capitalist model. But they can't get away with exploiting people in China because China controls the means of production. So it's going to be interesting how the capitalists get out of that one, basically. It's a bit of a conundrum for them. But I think if they see that there's profits to be made, then that might sway them a little bit. I don't know. I'm not an economist, but just how it seems to me.
Sorry, but you are the international editor of the Morning Star. So maybe you could explain to us a little bit about how, what is the paper's approach to the new Cold War? Because as you're saying, it is, well, we did say in the beginning, it's the first the only British socialist newspaper. And you're highlighting how it does report on stories that are completely ignored by the mainstream.
Yeah, well, we're the only English language socialist daily newspaper. I have to put it that way because some other newspapers get a bit upset if we say we're the only whatever and we miss something out. But those things we actually are. So what do we report on? Well, under our mastheading, we always say for peace and socialism. So we write about what it says on the tin, basically, and that is our approach. We are absolutely against any Cold War. We're against any war. We're absolutely supportive of China. We support what China is trying to do. This whole idea, I think, of socialism, communism with Chinese characteristics, I think is really, really important, because it breaks away from this idea that, there's like one size fits all, and you can have, the exact same thing in China as existed in the Soviet Union, as exists in Cuba, as exists, it's nonsense. They're different countries with different histories, with different challenges. When Fiona and I were out in Nicaragua recently, one of the things that one of the many kind of things that I got from that trip was you've got a country, small country, 6.5 million people, who are trying to build their own society based on the issues that face their country. And that it was just like a bell going off in my head saying, well, that's the same for everybody pretty much. But if you want to, you can't, massive mistake to try and build socialism on a notion of something that existed or something that somebody said, 100 years ago. You can take some of that stuff and we can use some of the basic principles of that, like no exploitation and all of that sort of stuff. We can take that, that who controls the means of production is pretty key, and all of, we can take those things, but you've got to set it within the context of the challenges that face your particular country. Nicaragua, small country with its history of dominance from the beast in the north, that they have to deal with the constant threat. China, much bigger country, but actually only, had to take, I don't know, what was it, 1 billion people or more? What was it, out of poverty? I can't remember the exact numbers. But massive. Million. Yeah, I mean, it's huge, right? Nobody's ever done that in the history of the world. Nobody. In fact, few have even tried to do that, as far as I can see. So you take people out of poverty, and then you try and build a nation based on the history, but also based on what natural resources have you got? What natural resources do you need? What is it that, what's your base of the country in terms of education and health and all of this sort of stuff? The size of the country, the sheer size of the country. So you've got all of these challenges. So it just makes sense to me that all you can ever do is say, we will try and build socialism on the basis of the characteristics of this country. And I think everybody should learn from that as well. It's certainly something that I'm conscious of as somebody who studies what happens in Africa. I'm really keen on this notion of, building socialism in African countries, not across, based on the particular history and the challenges that face that particular African country. Now, you'll see that I didn't say Africa generally, because I just think it's too big, and you can have unity across Africa, and I'm a Pan-Africanist for sure. But one of the things that we write about in the paper are those different challenges and how people are meeting those challenges on the ground, and not just politicians meeting them, but how people are struggling within their local communities to try and make a difference and to build progressive politics. And I think that's vital. So what we try and major on in the Morning Star is writing about people, and writing about how people are every day fighting back. So a large part of what we write about today, you will see in the paper. In tomorrow's paper, you'll see we'll be writing about my major article tomorrow is about the United Auto Workers Union going on strike last night, major strike against the big 3 car manufacturers in the US, right? Major thing, right? So we'll talk about, those workers are fighting back. We'll talk about workers fighting back in South Africa. Just this week, arguing for better health provision for people in South Africa. We'll write about Yemen tomorrow as well. We'll write about there's many of the things that we write about every day that just don't get touched on by any other news outlet, because they're not interested and it doesn't serve the corporate interests. But for us, bottom line, we're about peace and socialism, and that's what we're going to write about every day.
Well, make sure if you haven't already, make sure you are subscribed to the Morning Star and get your daily dose of peace and socialism. We're really, really happy about the collaboration we have with the Morning Star, because, as Roger was saying, they've taken a line against the Cold War, so it's been a really important place where we can get an argument out from no Cold War Britain. So we really appreciate that cooperation. You mentioned that the visit to Nicaragua to celebrate the 44th anniversary of the Sandinista Revolution. And since then, you've written quite a few articles about your trip, and I was wondering, what did you sense was the attitude within Nicaragua amongst the trade unionists and politicians and the communities and social movements to this whole new Cold War agenda? Because obviously, the Nicaraguan people, as you mentioned, got a really strong history of fighting for independence and sovereignty against threats from the United States. I was wondering, in this new world situation that's developing, what do you think the perspective of the Sandinistas in Nicaragua is?
Well, I think one of the highlights of the trip, I think for both of us, was the anniversary celebration and the speech given by Daniel Ortega. Now, I'm not afraid to say it, my Spanish is rubbish. So we sat through 2 hours, was it? 2 hour speech, and I didn't get most of it. I could pick out some bits of it, but when I went back afterwards to write a piece and got the translation, when we look at that, I think that speech gives a very clear indication of where the Sandinistas are coming from in terms of the new Cold War and the international relations of the current time, because Ortega called out the US for the imperialists that they are. He called out the EU as well, because he'd just come back from a summit there was a joint Latin American EU summit that had just taken place. And basically the EU were trying to, number one, invite Zelensky to come along to their meeting, and the Latin American countries refused to have that happen, quite rightly. But also they tried to set the agenda for the meeting in that old typical colonial way. We know what's best for you type thing. And Ortega called that out massively. And what he said, I think, which I thought was really important, was that it's this thing we talked about earlier on, that the global South have had enough of being dictated to, and that they want to chart a new way of doing things. And we've just seen starting today, 15th of September, in Havana, the G77 plus China meeting. So that literally opens as we speak, as we're doing this recording. Now that's really important, because one of the things they say in that, and Nicaragua is absolutely a part of that meeting, is that they say one of the key things that they want to see is the development of a new world economic order. Critical stuff, right? This is the global South plus China, who's not a full member of the G77, but plus China, at that meeting, saying that that's what they want to see. And that's what essentially the kind of approach that Ortega was saying in Nicaragua. I have to say something, though, about what some of our colleagues on the left and their attitude about Nicaragua. I've had before I went, some people were slagging me off, saying, "Well, what are you going there for?" and all that sort of stuff, and it's a revolution gone wrong, all this sort of stuff. And when I got back, somebody said to me that the revolution had been betrayed and all this sort of stuff. Well, what I say to people is this: is that the revolution and the Sandinista revolution promised free healthcare and free education when they came back to power, and they did that within 2 years. They are putting people first. The trade unions out there are not bit part players. We went to a meeting, Fiona and myself and some other colleagues, we went to a meeting with trade union leaders out there, top trade union leaders in the country, some of whom are also members of the Nicaraguan Assembly as well. And they were very clear that they can still bargain with the employer and the state. They can still do that bargaining. But they are really clear whose interest they are there for. They are there for the interests of their members, and they were prepared to stand up for their members in the workplace and in the assembly as well. I don't see that in the UK Labour Party, it has to be said, who seem to be doing everything that they possibly can to distance themselves from the trade union movement, like they were some kind of disreputable relative that they could well do without, in the same room. So for me, what I see in Nicaragua are people trying to build a revolution. They are very clear that people can have a comment about what they're doing out there. That is fine, right? But I say this: you never ever tell people who are in struggle how to do their struggle. I think that's arrogant. I think it's rude. I think it's disrespectful, and I think it's typically it's a typical colonial attitude that we know best from sitting here in Oxford or whatever about how best people in Managua can organize themselves to build their revolution. Comrade Fidel Castro was right. A revolution is no bed of roses, right? It's no bed of roses. Things are difficult, and it's even more difficult when you got to the north here. Babylon Central up in Washington, D.C. It is tough when you've got them peering down at you, millions of people. So I think the left needs to be clearer about giving full support to the people of Nicaragua, and understanding that what's happening in Nicaragua is absolutely part of the Cold War. It's absolutely part of the Cold War. You demonize a country, we've spoken about this already. You demonize the Nicaraguans, you demonize Ortega, you demonize the things that they're trying to do. You even demonize them when they stand up against people who try and stage a coup in the country. You say that they should have just let that happen somehow, right? I mean, so I think the left needs to stand firmly and squarely with the Nicaraguans and let the people who are in struggle lead that struggle. Frankly, I have to say, this is something that somebody who's been involved as a Black activist for years, it's something that I've had my whole life, where people have been trying to tell me how to do the struggle against racism. White folk have been telling me, well, you shouldn't do that, you should do this. White splaining to me about what I should do to tackle racism. Now they can really stuff it where the sun don't shine, frankly. Not having it, right? People involved in the struggle lead that struggle. Very happy for advice, very happy for people to be there alongside us, but not telling us what to do and not speaking on our behalf. And that should happen with Nicaragua, and it should happen with China, and it should happen across the globe, where people are standing up against this massive threat that the US poses.
Yeah, well, very well said. Agree completely with that, Roger. And well, I was wondering actually if you had any ideas that you'd like to share with us about, how we can build a movement against this new Cold War in Britain. Obviously it's a very difficult challenge that we've got ahead of us. There's huge propaganda, there's censorship. We are in a minority, this perspective in Britain, but we're part of an international majority. So just wondered if you had any ideas about how we can move forward from where we are at the moment.
I think it's always, I'm an organizer at heart. That's what I've always been. Even when I was at Unison, I was head of organizing. And one of the things that I always said, you make more progress when you get people talking to people. So we need to find a way of making sure we put more people together to talk with each other. Actually, it was one of the great things about what happened with our trip for Nicaragua, I felt, was that we had loads of people who wouldn't necessarily have had a chance to meet and chat with each other to be able to do that. But we have that challenge across the globe, because I think there's loads of people around the globe, millions of people, I'd say, who actually agree with our perspective. So one of the things that I've been saying to some comrades recently was that, around where one of the places we started with this discussion with BRICS. One of the things about BRICS is that it brings those countries together who want to talk about doing things differently. Well, around BRICS, I think we need a social movement around that. as well. So bringing that doesn't necessarily rely on the fact that you have to be one of the nations who are members of BRICS, because frankly the UK will never be a member of BRICS, thankfully. But what we need to be able to do is have worker to worker, person to person contact across the globe, and we have the means to be able to do that electronically. But also there's plenty of opportunities, I think, where we can have those kind of contact moments, person to person, as well. And I think we should look to try and do that, and to build the number of people who are taking this message out. So then the next thing is how, as well as the person to person, how can you develop the kind of propaganda that we need as well? Obviously, I'm going to say, everybody should subscribe to the Morning Star, and if you don't buy the daily print edition, then subscribe online. Got there's other websites that I'll come to later on, that I think are really, really useful in terms of getting the message out there as well. But I think that we need to be investing time and energy into our print, but also things like this, which I just think is wonderful. So the podcasts that are, this is one of them now, and other podcasts that are around, that are just enabling people to talk about what it is that they're experiencing every day, and finding ways of getting that out to people, whether it's through this kind of social media networks that we have, or whether it's through some of the online platforms or websites or whatever that are around. But I think essentially, I think my message would be this, is that it's really important that those of us who agree with each other, spend time agreeing with each other, and gaining strength from that agreement, because it can get really lonely when you think, oh God, no bugger actually kind of agrees with me here, and I'm on my own. So having that strength that comes from people being able to talk with each other, I think is great. But we can't just stay there. I think the work that you're all doing in terms of trying to develop a social media presence, I think is fantastic and really needed. But it needs to reach, what is it? The bear reach those parts that other bears cannot reach. We need to get to people who don't currently agree with us. What we always said in organizing circles is that the challenge is always how you move people who don't agree with you today to agree with you tomorrow, for them to be able to go out the day after and get somebody else to agree with them. That's the challenge. So I think one of the things that I would suggest as well is that we just think about spending some time thinking about that challenge, in how we grow that work. I mean, one of the things that a friend of mine, Nigel Flanagan, who has written a book about trade unions recently, that he talks about developing a kind of tree, if you like, with branches coming off. So you have, somebody starts there with an idea or a perspective, and then you get somebody coming off from that to talk about, with their contacts. So everyone's got 5 contacts. Go and talk to those 5 contacts, and each of those 5 contacts go off and talk to 5 contacts of their own. Before long, you've got a bigger tree of people. So one of the things I'd say is that we can come together with activist meetings, which is great, but we need to send people off with a clear task of go off and talk to this many people and come back. There's an old story from the Black Country, so around where I come from originally, where I was born, Walsall, Wolverhampton, West Brom and all of that in the West Midlands. And there's an old story of black workers trying to organize in a foundry in the black country. And because the union was racist where they were, what they did was they met in a toilet every day. And all they did was they would say to each other, right, you go away and you talk to this person, that person, and this person, and come back here at this time tomorrow and tell us how you got on, right? Basic organizing, right? And you can spiral it out. It's a spider's web type thing, really. You can spiral it out from there by just not getting bogged down in bureaucracy, but actually setting people clear tasks to go off and do things, little small things. But then what you never ever do is ask somebody to go away and do something at the same kind of level the next time. You always ask them to do a little bit more. And that's the secret of organizing. Never ask anybody to go away and do something at the same level twice. You always ask a tad more, but enough so you're not scaring them off or burning them out, because there are only a few of us at the minute and we can't burn each other out.
This makes me think of, there's a lot of people who maybe they want to be involved. They do want to go out and spread the word, but they don't have the confidence maybe because they're not really informed. So, I guess this is the time where you can name drop and recommend whoever, where do these people go? Where do we go?
Well, you go to, because you two are the best people that I know anyway. So you've got great information at your disposal, and I think that's great. They should obviously, as I've said before, come to the Morning Star and read what we've got to say about stuff. There's other websites. People's Dispatch, I think, is outstanding, absolutely outstanding. And they do a daily brief as well, which is on YouTube. Which again I think is outstanding. So news stories of the day, and so I think there's outlets like that are just doing some really, really important pieces of work. And if you look at the Globetrotter website, so Vijay Prashad's work, and some of the things that he's been writing about, I just think it's groundbreaking stuff that just puts things in their proper anti-colonial perspective and links up, the kind of struggles that are taking place around the world. Because I think one of the things that is too easy to fall into, it's a real trap, I think, because we don't have the access to the kind of widespread information that most people have. It's too easy for us to think we're losing and that, there's nobody doing anything out there. Well, you know what? There's loads of people doing stuff. What they're not is just not joined up enough. And I think there's some great books out there that really help us. Again, VJ's work is great. But you asked me to think of a book, so I'm going to tell you this well-worn book called How Europe Underdeveloped Africa by Walter Rodney. And I would recommend that to everybody who reads this if you want to see about what happened to Africa, how it was deliberately underdeveloped, but also you reading that book, you'll be able to see why it is people in West Africa and Central Africa in particular are fighting back. It's because they've had enough of being treated like that. They've had enough of having all of their natural resources stripped out of the ground and for poverty wages. If any wages at all that they can get hold of. They're sick to death of, during the COVID crisis, people in South Africa producing vaccines, producing the vaccines for big companies like Johnson & Johnson, and then and then finding that Johnson & Johnson shipped all that up to the big industrial nations, and that there were hardly any vaccines for people in South Africa or across the west of Africa. Or across the whole of Africa, and people have cottoned onto this stuff. And I think that part of our job as socialists, part of our job is to expose these critical points. And then it is always about not just, well, we've told them, so that is the end of our job. we tell them, and then we organize people around that with any means that's at our disposal, whether that's online or whether that's put in different groups together, different individuals who've got something to offer together. But we provide the information, then we put people together. My experience as an organizer is always, if you put people online together, they always want to meet. Always want to get together in person at some point. Then we've got to find a way of getting people together in person at some point. And I think that's the task. So there's a lot of stuff out there. Some of it that we need to delve back into history a little bit. We can look at the work of Walter Rodney. We can look at VJ's work. There's a whole lot of stuff. Some of the stuff, the stuff that John Ross has been writing, I think is exceptional. Carlos Martinez's stuff on China, I think, is exceptional. Again, so there's people writing this stuff, and I think our job is to get it out there to people. And I think there's opportunities for us to do it. I think some of it's online, some of it's bringing people together, but I think fundamentally it's about having that ambition and giving people some hope that they can make a difference, because everyone's ground down. Everybody thinks, been told forever, that there's no point in doing any of this stuff, because what's the point anyway? And I'm too tired and I've got a million other meetings to go to and all of this stuff. Well, you know what? This is the moment, I think. This is a pivotal moment at the minute where we've got real change potentially at our fingertips. I really do think, was it Andretta Roy said something about, you can, if you listen carefully, you can hear the world change. You can just hear the world changing. And I think if you do listen carefully, you can just about hear, the creaking chair of people moving around to make that sort of change. And I think it's a great moment to be an activist at the minute. Really great moment. Got a lot of work to do.
Thank you so much. I think that was wonderful. And what a lovely, lovely note to end on. We have hope, a hell of a lot of work to do, and the resources to do it. So thank you. Thank you for joining our first ever episode of the No Cold War podcast. No Cold War Britain podcast.
It's a great honor. Thank you so much.